to the Corbett Report.
Welcome friends, James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com, in a conversation that is being recorded on the 29th of April 2016, and today we're joined on the line by Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century Wire. I hope that all of my listeners will already be familiar with Patrick and his work, but if not, please go to 21stcenturywire.com, link in the show notes to check out some of that work. Today, specifically, we're going to be talking about a very important, very extensive and extensively researched article that he's recently written called An Introduction, Smart Power and the Human Rights Industrial Complex. Patrick, thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Good to be with you, James.
Let's get into this article, which is, as I say, very expansive and very detailed. And so maybe to get a handle on this, let's just start by defining this human rights industrial complex that you identify. What are the moving parts involved here, and how do they relate together?
It's kind of, I can narrow it down to human rights because I think that's an issue that a lot of people can relate with. It's actually bigger than, let's say, the human rights charities, for instance. These are some of the organizations that I discussed in this paper, which we published a couple of months ago. Now, I think human rights is key here because if you think about the trend in interventionism and interventionist foreign policy over the last 20 years, one of the main devices, the main tools in order to get the public on side with a humanitarian intervention, for instance, is the human rights issue. So this can be expanded out into feminism, international feminism. It can be expanded into weapons of mass destruction, torture by said regimes that are unfavorable for the Western powers, for instance. People are all familiar with this. Now, it's taken on a whole new dimension in the last few years, and part of this is powered by the internet. It's powered by web-based and social media applications. And some of the leading organizations in there are, you can trace them back to the usual suspects who we are familiar with, like George Soros, the Open Society Foundation, Freedom House, and many others, and also Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so forth. And I'm focusing on the charities because I think this is, in my opinion, quite a cynical use of these human rights charities, because in the end, I have to be clear, I support NGOs. I think there's a role for NGOs around the world. I know a lot of people who work in NGOs, and for the most part, these are good people. They're hardworking and they're well-meaning and they're dedicated to their mission. And however, most of the large, high-profile NGOs are basically tools of the people who fund them, be they governments. In terms of the United States, directly funds a number of these NGOs, and through George Soros, Wall Street billions of funds, tranche funds. So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Avaz, a number of these organizations, 38 Degrees, I could go on and on. These are all big society, social entrepreneur businesses and applications through charities and so forth. So, and these also have big corporate donors. Many of these happen to be the beneficiaries of the foreign policy interventionism. There is a revolving door between human rights charities, Washington State Department, and also a number of other these sort of third sector organizations. So there are people working through all of these organizations. So that's my main point.
Well, let's look at a specific example so that we can get people on board with what we're talking about here. And I wanted to look at this Suzanne Nossel character that you point out in this article, who I think not only in terms of what she advocates, for example, in an article that she wrote for Foreign Affairs back in 2004 called Smart Power that we'll link to in the show notes, but also just in her biography itself. Her biography is kind of a living, breathing example of what you're talking about here, the nexus of State Department and charity. So let's talk a little bit about Suzanne.
So if you're familiar with the term soft power, soft power, if in its proper definition, would refer to, I would say, would refer to media coverage and using the media in order to create perception management. Okay, and you could extend this to English language media, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and these are examples of soft power in its early stages. It developed, however, into something much more complex and much more digital. And to take that to a new level, soft power has been reformed into smart power. The inventor of that term, I believe it's Susan Nocell, is the person who really originally coined that term and put some weight to it. And she's got a very interesting background. She's a high-powered public relations professional, so she's worked for right from the State Department, went straight into the head position at Amnesty International in the U.S., Amnesty America. And at the very same time, Amnesty is running public relations advertising campaigns about NATO, no-fly zones in Syria, Russia needs to stop sending arms to Assad, etc. But her background with Human Rights Watch, another Soros-funded charity, and also McKinsey and Company, famous law firm with great connections to the deep state. So she's very talented, but she's also a PR professional. And I think this is the main point, is that in the 21st century, perception management is everything, because although we all might agree that the governments have incredible power and military has overwhelming force in the United States and NATO, they still need the public to have some backing. They call it the bottom 51%. Is how some people might refer to this in the super bureaucratic class. So if they can take care of the bottom 51%, then this greases the tracks, as it were, for any kind of intervention or the construction of a shadow state in a place like Syria, or parallel government structures in Libya and Syria, and all in the name of humanitarian intervention. So Suzanne Nocell was a key player, but also just a good example of the revolving door between the State Department, the human rights industry. I'll call it industry because it's $1 billion industry, and also other of these charities and third sector organizations. So she's only a perfect example of that, although I don't think she's in a fantastic steering position at the moment. She's cycled out of some of these organizations into a new organization now, but it's a good example.
So essentially what we're talking about here is a psychological operation that is waged against the public in order to get them on board with these aggressive interventions in various places around the world. And this, I mean, we've seen this play out so many times by now, from the former Yugoslavia to Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. We've seen this same narrative rolled out over and over, but I think one that obviously is still at the forefront of the news headlines these days is what's happening in Syria. Let's talk a little bit about the Syrian narrative and how that was developed by these types of organizations working in concert with the State Department and the Pentagon.
Sure. We're all familiar with the no-fly zone as a concept. And in Syria, the no-fly zone was rebranded. It was tweaked somewhat to called the safe zone. So this is a common lexicon used by all the sort of media heads and experts and politicians in the State Department. So the creation of first was a no-fly zone, then a safe zone. These third sector organizations and online websites like Avaz have launched all these polling campaigns, and it's kind of to get young people and millennials engaged in the issue. And the earliest real good example of this was Coney 2012, a couple of years ago, where they actually got U.S. school children to empty their piggy banks out to help to get the idea of military intervention deployment in Uganda at the front of the White House's and the State Department's priority list. And it was really a PR exercise because that agenda was already in play with AFRICOM. But it's about perception management. So in Syria, Syria is basically the most multifaceted, multi-layered operation ever. Okay, so it's got 5 sides and 3 layers, and any way you turn it, you'll see a different third sector organization. So there is the construction of all of this consensus building around the edges, and then there is the actual penetration. In other words, where the soft power and the smart power becomes hard power on the ground, not in the military sense, but literally building. It's not a shadow state. It's more like a prosthesis. They're building parallel parts of what might call in Britain the big society. And these are through organizations that have already been, and methods that have been road tested in the West already, in Britain and America, through leadership training, leadership councils, through organizations like Common Purpose in Britain. These are international third sector NGOs. And so they've taken this technology and been able to weaponize aspects of it to create the Syrian civil defense, for instance, the white helmets in Syria. That is basically, it's masquerading as a first responder organization, but it's funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And what they're doing is basically constructing a kind of parallel organizations that are embedded inside Syria to basically guarantee, in my mind anyway, either it's a militia in waiting or it's a stay-behind intelligence operation or whatever it is. It's a good example of well-funded by the EU, by the British Foreign Office, by USAID as well. So these are all these organizations that you and many others will be familiar with that are putting a lot of resources into constructing these prosthetic social organizations in places like Syria. But to do this, you need to ramp up the public relations campaign. So Starvation in Madaya was a big PR campaign before Christmas. That was completely mischaracterized by the Western media, by the BBC, by all of the mainstream media outlets in the West. Totally jump on board. They don't check any of the facts. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is another example, quoted by the UN, the darling of the Guardian. The State Department even quotes them. They're now quoting, and basically promoting the white helmets. Syrian civil defense is a similar sort of thing. Bellingcat is another example. This is a Atlantic Council linked, NATO linked blogger, which is meant to look like it's an independent open source intelligence blog, but really it's absolutely embedded right in there with to basically put Bellingcat's interesting because Elliot Higgins, I think his name is, so it was meant to look like crowdfunding started this, and it was just this innocent guy in his bedroom searching for the truth, and he put forward the idea that the Assad government in 2013 in August launched sarin gas attacks against his own people. He was one of the first people to see that idea. And then MH17, that Russia or Russian rebels had somehow shot down MH17 just for kicks. And then Bellingcat, this blog basically says that Russia is not targeting any ISIS targets. This was this talking point. And if you look at all of these cascade across the media, so they use the blogs or the sort of facade of an independent media as the mainstream media uses that as a source to then cascade through right up to the government level. It's a very clever and very well designed system. However, over time, it sort of collapses on itself because the facts don't match up. This idea of open source intelligence that John Kerry and others use time and time again, along with these internet polling campaigns and third sector PR campaigns by Purpose, they don't match up with the facts on the ground. Eventually, it collapses because you can't fabricate real events. And this is the problem that they run into. But they seem to want to push as long as they can push the agenda and keep it moving steadily in one direction, they don't really care about anything that's going to be debunked further along in the timeline. So it's just, to me, it is a kind of radical pragmatism for the millennial generation. So this is where neoconservatism and this sort of hard power has now morphed into smart power, and this is what we see. So it's designed to penetrate the public perception and it's the outsourcing of consensus building, essentially, is what it is.
Well, yes, and it's interesting how sources like Bellingcat will end up being quoted in the mainstream media, but somehow or other the open source intelligence of 21st Century Wire or Corbett Report, somehow that doesn't quite get into the media. I wonder how that works.
No, and and we published a lot of stories about the white helmets, and I have sent those to mainstream journalists and gotten no reply at all. So to me, it's a scoop waiting to happen, and it's up to them whether they want to run with it. But we'll continue to just put the facts together and put the story together and put it out. There's not a lot we can do at this point, but I think it's interesting. You have touched on a point there. I think there is a kind of in the mainstream media, especially in the West, specifically in North America. Europe is there's a little more leeway in countries like Germany and even the UK, although it is heavily controlled. In America, it is absolutely repressive, the environment in the press. And I found this is interesting, James, because in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War, there was this kind of open rebellion against the Bush administration and I'm a child of that time, basically. I came out of that that cauldron, basically, where people were very angry, knew that they had been lied to, and were openly challenging the state and the agenda and the people and the individuals, basically. And it changed under Barack Obama. And I think Libya was a big turning point where the media completely got on side and it literally closed ranks in a way that we're still seeing now with Syria. And in the face of all the facts, in the face of all the lies, from one false flag plot to the next, to one fake charity organization to the next, to funding al-Nusra Front, arming al-Qaeda in Syria, the media has closed ranks and they will not challenge the state agenda. And if they do, it's very late in the game after there's no policy effect. So in other words, they'll wait 3 years. So this was the result of the Libyan project. I think this is where the change started happening from, so the last dinosaurs of the Bush era of protest, the John Pilgers of the world and these big mainstream media guys, that they're still challenging that. But it's I think, to be honest, James, I think the methods employed by the state, by the shadow state, by these parallel organizations are getting so complicated, and the subterfuge is so deep and multi-layered that most mainstream media journalists are unable to track it unless you've been on it from the beginning. And I know that people like you and others who have studied hard power or have studied coercion, like through Gladio and things like this, you're nothing surprises you. You know that the depths the state will go to ram through an agenda, be it military or geopolitical. So you're already open to these ideas, and I think there are a lot of people in mainstream media, newspapers, and especially broadcast journalists, they're not open at all to that because they haven't studied some of those things in recent history. So, but the information's there. It's absolutely there. Anybody can go research it. We don't have any special access to anything that other people don't have just by looking at social media and basic reports out of the Middle East.
On the note of the Syria Civil Defense Units, the White Helmets that you were talking about, there was an interesting story that played out this past week where Raid Saleh, the head of the organization, was on his way to Washington to accept an award, a humanitarian award from Interaction, an NGO based in Washington, D.C., and he was actually prevented from entering the States. His visa was revoked and he was told to go back where he came from, according to press reports. What happened there? Is the State Department getting rid of the White Helmets, or what's going on?
Well, I think I was watching the press conference from yesterday, and Mark Toner, one of the State Department spokespeople, was caught off guard, basically caught on the back foot on this question when it was posed to him by Matthew Lee from the Associated Press. And the Salah, the leader of the White Helmets, their sort of public face, if you will. The reports are that he has links to extremist organizations. Now, we know from our research that that's al-Nusra Front, basically. And so I think it's possible that the American contingent either were caught off guard on this issue, and they had to do a quick U-turn. This guy had to send him back, essentially. So I don't know. They're putting USAID has pumped about $23 million into the White Helmets, And so the America has a big investment. Britain has potentially a bigger investment in that. In fact, the White Helmets were founded by James Le Mesurier, who is a graduate of Sandhurst, a top NATO military mind. Okay, so we're meant to believe that he just wanted to start a first responders organization, teach them how to, rescue people from the rubble. They claim they've saved 40,000 lives from Assad's or an ISIS brutality. I personally don't know where they get these numbers, and I would tend to think any numbers coming out of Syria, from my experience with the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, is that they're not going to be very accurate at all. In fact, they'll be fudged, inflated, misrepresented, and this is what I've found with the casualty numbers in the last 5 years in Syria as a whole. So I don't put a lot of credibility in that 40,000, but yet the State Department has no problem bandying that statistic around.
All right, well, let's wrap this up by taking a look at what we have here. As we say, we have a psychological warfare that's being perpetrated against the people generally in order to get them on board with this war agenda and handing out Nobel Peace Prizes to these fake groups that are being supported by USAID and all the rest. What is the answer to this? What do we do to counteract this? I think part of the answer has to be just conversations like this, exposing these tools for what they are so that they can't be used in that way to generate support. But what about, as you say, all the well-meaning people that are caught up in organizations like this that truly believe that they're doing good and don't want to hear otherwise? How do we reach people like that?
I think they're going to be affected by these conversations. And, they talk about their bottom 51% that they need to basically shore up public opinion for. But we only need, I think, in terms of political awareness, I would say 1% or something like this will be enough for the idea to get around. In some countries right now, the NGO complex is basically dead. In countries like Egypt, if you remember back in late 2011, they raided like 17 Western NGO offices, including Freedom House and the National Democratic Institute, and actually brought charges, prosecuted a number of Western NGO workers, including Ray LaHood's son, Sam LaHood, a high-profile politician from the U.S. So Russia basically listed George Soros's organizations as unfriendly. So a number of other countries like Hungary are looking maybe more skeptically at some of these organizations than they were before. So the game is, in my opinion anyway, the game is up. It's definitely up in Syria. They're not going to tolerate any of that sort of influence peddling on that level. And they do understand. I think the Syrians you got to give them a little more credit than they're given in the West in terms of their sophistication. But they do understand and are aware of all these things. But in terms of the West, my problem with this, and the thing that's saddest, is that people would be, children would be donating money through Kony 2012 campaigns, not knowing that they're basically playing a part in, military interventionism. And there's people who will also give money to a lot of organizations that, quite frankly, don't need it. Or talented people going to work for organizations that are really just fronts. And, USAID and the White Helmets are one and the same. They're both basically humanitarian fronts for a deeper agenda, a deep state agenda. And so they're both representations of each other in that respect. And this is ditto for the Brookings Institute and any of the think tanks that provide the policy backing and the sort of ideological backing for these things that we see happening on the ground. So I think people are understanding this more and more now, and I think it's a question of time. And then they will have to morph this operation into something else. People are seeing the fake media as well. Foundation-funded media organizations are everywhere, on the right and the left. And I think people are becoming smart to this now. So it's a question of time. And the facts, you can't make up things, and they can't stay up to scrutiny for a long period of time. This is the case with things like Bellingcat. They come, they play their role, and then they disappear. because all their work is meaningless because it doesn't stand up to the test of time. And so that's also something that will undermine this in the long run. However, if you've got money like George Soros and you're able to spread it around, and he plays that sort of role of Goldfinger with these organizations, then it will continue. They'll change, they'll get more sophisticated, but I think the public are also getting more sophisticated. People in the developing world are getting smarter, and they're identifying these things a lot faster, and they're like, well, we don't need the National Endowment for Democracy to come into our African country and lecture us on something that we really know is just a Trojan horse for U.S. AFRICOM in order to evict the Chinese or whatever the agenda is that year in Africa, for instance. So I think people, even in those countries, are becoming a lot more wiser to these sort of programs.
Well, hopefully that is the case, and hopefully, again, conversations like this will advance that narrative. And for more of the detail and information, I'm going to direct people once again to this excellent detailed article. And if you have read it and you do enjoy it, I hope you'll spread it out to others. It's called An Introduction, Smart Power and the Human Rights Industrial Complex. It's on 21st Century Wire. And of course, Patrick Henningsen not only writes for them, he's also the host of Sunday Wire that I've been a guest on a number of times in the past. So please check that out if you haven't yet done so. Patrick Henningsen, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, James, very much.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by the Corbett Report subscriber, a weekly newsletter featuring James Corbett's International Forecaster editorial, recommended reading and viewing, discounts on Corbett Report DVDs, and once a month, a subscriber-only video.